Hey friends, this week on the show, I am joined by author Randy Boyagoda for a fantastic conversation on writing, the Catholic imagination, and how we as Catholics live and breathe and interact with the world, understand our faith, and how we see that reflected in literature, in writing, in art, in architecture, and all around us. It's a great in-depth conversation, really from the heart of the church, about how we as Catholics engage with the world, live out our vocations, and really do life, and see that. And Randy, as a writer, speaks from that place, and we have a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, and hey, thanks for watching. Hey friends, welcome to the show. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, we're on podcast, everywhere fine podcasts are found. If you're listening, we're also on YouTube at youtube.com/the Cordial Catholic to watch what you are listening to. I am joined this week, very happy to have him, with Randy Boyagoda. He is the author of 6 books, including the novels Governor of the Northern Province, Beggar's Feast, Original Print, and Dante's Indiana, just out recently. His work has been nominated for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, the MPAC Dublin Literary Prize, and named a Globe and Mail Best Book of the Year and a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Wow. He's an essayist, a book critic, a radio columnist, and a professor of English at the University of Toronto, up here in Canada, where he lives with his wife and their 4 daughters. Randy, I'm so pleased to have you on the show. Thank you for being here. Welcome and hello.
Good to see you, Keith. Glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Very happy to have you. And the only problem, Randy, I should warn you about having a Canadian on the show, because I'm, of course, Canadian as well. We tend to get into trouble because we end up just apologizing the whole time on the show, going round and round saying sorry and thank you and sorry and thank you. And it really tends to bore the listeners. So that could be the only problem we run into with this episode with 2 Canadians in the same conversation.
Also that and the glare on our respective giant foreheads. It might be difficult for some viewers, but luckily listeners, they can't hear the glare. As far as I can tell, there's no throbbing or anything.
Yeah. Maybe a podcast only episode based on the giant. I try and cut down with the lights here, the glare in the forehead, but I think as my hair begins to recede into the sunset, the glare just I think gets worse.
Isn't it the old saying, Keith? You have a beautiful forehead for podcasting. Isn't that what people say?
That is, yeah, you know what? That is a very popular saying in podcasts. Yeah, forehead for podcasting. Yeah, that's fantastic. Randy, I'm thrilled to have you. And I there's so much to talk about with you, and I want to get to a lot. So where I want to begin, though, is thinking about of this, right? I was not raised Catholic. Listeners to this show know that. A lot of listeners to this show are also in that situation. There's converts, there's new Catholics, there's Catholics of all stripes listening to this show, watching this show. For me, I became a Christian in high school, and then I was an adult when I became Catholic. And what struck me in becoming Catholic, Randy, was I suddenly was entered into when I began looking into the Catholic Church and reading church theologians and fiction and literature around from Catholic authors and Catholic ideas. I felt like I was suddenly initiated into the secret club, and suddenly there was this world, this culture that was all around me before that I didn't even really recognize or see until I began to understand Catholicism, and suddenly it was as if this the secret society opened up to me. And here were all these things, these references I hadn't quite got before, these public things and displays and mentions of Catholic things that I really had no idea were there before. My eyes were open to this weird Catholic world, this Catholic imagination that I had no idea even existed. So I wonder for you, I mean, my immersion in the Catholic faith was later in life, but what was for you as somebody who writes from the space of the Catholic imagination as you do in your books? Tell us a bit about maybe growing up or the culture you were immersed in. Sure. as you began as a Catholic or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, let me just begin by observing the fundamental paradox of what you just described. 2,000-year-old global billion-person members-only club that seems secretive somehow.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I understand what you mean, in a sense from the inside, and by that I mean I am what you would describe as a cradle Catholic. My parents, who immigrated to Canada from Sri Lanka in the 1960s, were themselves cradle Catholics. My dad came from a Buddhist Catholic family. My mother came from Catholicism on both sides, probably dating to the 17th century arrival of the Portuguese as imperialists in then Ceylon, bringing with them Catholicism. That's my kind of informal guess of kind of where Catholicism in Sri Lanka likely came from. It predates it in a much fuller way, as you probably know, in a place like India. But I grew up probably like a lot of first world ethnic people, in that I grew up with a faith, in our case Catholicism, that was presumed all around me, but not something that was self-conscious or something about which I was self-aware. I went to Catholic school. My friends were mostly Catholic. I grew up in a time and place, 1980s, Oshawa, Ontario, a small town outside of Toronto, the child of Sri Lankan immigrants, where I guess I took for granted a great deal of the kind of Catholic-infused world I lived in. Church league hockey, a phrase that perhaps seems strange, maybe to many listeners and viewers now, would have been normal. Kind of trips to the Martyrs Shrine in Midland, Ontario.
Yeah.
For kind of giant ethnic Catholic jamborees, again, would seem normal. So you kind of take it for granted, and there's a beauty to that, and then there's also a danger to that, I would say, and I probably experienced both growing up.
Yeah, well, let's talk a bit more about that, because that's always for me been very interesting. I remember I read a book by George Weigel when I was first looking at becoming Catholic, and he kind of outlined in that book the idea of these Catholic ghettos, the idea of these Catholic places where in the past, if you were Catholic, you'd be raised in these deep Catholic communities. And he contrasted that with how we do our Catholicism these days, which is really a lot more individualistic and not in these communities. There's not this Polish section of town where all the Polish people live and they go to their church that's in their neighborhood. Or we have a Portuguese Catholic church down the street from us, but it's not as if everyone around there that lives there is Portuguese. They come from all over the city. So he was kind of saying that we've lost this idea of this kind of ethnic Catholicism that is your community, and have to kind of fill in that gap somehow with how we're all separated and disparate and living our Catholic lives separate from our neighborhood, that little niche where we live. Does that make sense? Because
it makes exactly half sense. I say as much with George as a friend and mentor. It makes perfect sense for white Northern European understandings of North American Catholicism. I suspect if you are Filipino, if you are South Asian, if you are Vietnamese, and you are a practicing Catholic, there are probably sizable parts of a place like Toronto where what you just described would remain exactly that, only it's not Irish or Italian or Portuguese anymore. So I think it does remain, but the demographics have shifted. I think maybe the further point that George is observing, though, is the kind of the relationship, let's say, between growing up in an integrated world where your faith life, your family life, your social life is all connected, and then growing up in a world where you have to make a decision about these connections. I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of the work of Charles Taylor, and in particular, what I'm thinking about is A Secular Age. And in that book, dating from, 2007, Taylor makes the observation, kind of famously at the beginning, that we've moved from a time and place where in the year, let's say 1500, in the North Atlantic regions of the world, it would have been assumed, no matter what was going on inside Keith, it would have been assumed that you believed in God. To a time and place 500 years later, where it is now assumed that you don't believe in God. No matter what happens at the end of the day, late at night by yourself in your room, it's assumed you don't believe in God. And in a secular age, Taylor wants to make sense of that shift. And that's a shift that I think many believing people, very much so Catholics, have to kind of struggle with and make decisions about. And I think where the pressure really happens is in two moments. You have to make a decision about what you really believe when it comes to raising children and what it means to share what you received. And then you have to make a decision, I think, probably when you're no longer a child, in that moment or those moments beyond being at home, perhaps when you go off to university or you leave the house and you're no longer going to church just because that's what you always do. You now have to make a decision to go to church. And I think those are very important moments in the life, very important kind of decisions in the life of a Catholic.
Well, you said that I totally agree with you. You said that it was a kind of a good and a bad thing being raised in kind of in the community that you were raised in. Mm-hmm. I guess the bad thing there maybe is that you haven't been exposed to anything else until you go away. Is that maybe a drawback for that kind of?
Well, there's two. I think maybe one, and certainly there's a significant amount of fiction that would be written about this, would be a sense of suffocation.
Yeah.
Right. If you have a different view or a different desire for your life, your vocation, it's not made possible. If you're living in this kind of integrated, intensely kind of local world, faith, family, social life, all connected together. So there's that. But then I think the other would be kind of what you were describing in a sense earlier from the outside coming in that you take things for granted. And you don't really understand how much fullness, how much richness, how many layers and textures there are to your life because of the way that Catholicism can suffuse it. I'll give you an example of it. Years ago, when I was in graduate school in Boston, I went to visit with my roommate, his family in a small town in New Hampshire. And this would be the nth generation of Irish Catholic Boston. And so it's not entirely clear, how actively practicing every member of the family is at this point. Certainly there are practicing members of the faith within the family. But what I'm remembering is we went to Burger King, my roommate, me, and then his big brother. And his big brother did not strike me as any kind of practicing anything. He seemed like a pretty regular guy. And we ordered our food, and my roommate ordered a Whopper. And his brother hit him in the head and said, "What are you doing, dum-dum? It's Lent. It's a Friday in Lent." And I was stunned by this, that he had this active a sense of liturgical time and of what it meant, because there wasn't really observably much else about his life that seemed to me, at least, to have been kind of decision-inflected Catholicism, and yet that was there. And that strikes me as kind of a wonderful, deep thing that comes from an immersion in the faith that you take for granted until you see it.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I guess those things are the flip side. The flip side of those things, I guess, are, I met some friends in university who identified as Catholic, and I was kind of searching at that time, looking at this massive 2,000-year-old thing called the Catholic Church, and kind of curious. And I met some friends who were just nominal to a point of hilarity. It was kind of funny how nominal they were, but also had some very strongly ingrained Catholic beliefs. So sure. I had one friend who was very much, we were in poli-sci together, and he was very much had very strong pro-life views, and this was something that he thought was very, very important to him. He described himself as a pro-life Catholic in the early days of Facebook, when you used to have to put in all your different your views and religion on Facebook.
That got him a lot of likes. Go on.
Yeah. But that was his kind of the extent to his Catholic identity. If I ever pressed him, asked him any more questions, or
didn't have much more to say, huh?
It was fascinating. So there was kind of this thing hanging on, this thing he'd been raised with that was kind of hanging on there, which I guess is one of the downsides of this cultural Catholicism, because there was not much else there. So right, it's as if that the thing with the Lent at the Burger King, if this were just something hanging on there that didn't really have any meaning apart from this thing we always just do this. There's something there's a bit of a drawback with that, or not great at the same time. You know what I mean? There's two ways to slice that, I think.
Maybe there's two ways to look at something like that. In one sense, you're absolutely right that if that were to substitute for a more lived faith, then that is genuinely a disappointment and a problem. I certainly see that in pre-pandemic times when we would have kind of daily or regular, let's say regular mass in a local parish, and to see certain families who have a sense, even certain ethnic groups have a sense of what time to arrive in order to be there in time for the baptism immediately after mass. So they don't come for church, but they show up, at 10:48, just when people are walking back to their pews from communion. They just kind of sit right down as if they're doing likewise. And I don't think it's because they'd already gone to mass earlier that day, but because they've timed it for when they need to show up for the baptism. And so take that as the example. We believe in a reality, independent of our desires as related to the sacraments themselves. So that's real for that child. And yet every other part of that experience would seem to be pretty much an inversion of the first order theological experience to second order family experience, right? So that again is a problem, but it's a problem that has at the same time something real at the heart of it. I'll give you one other example. I used to do a radio show for CBC years ago. It was a panel for Sounds Like Canada with Sheila Rogers. And I was on with a couple of others, and it was a kind of a debate, a current affairs debate sort of thing. And one of the people that I was on with every week he had grown up Catholic, had a pretty terrible experience of the faith growing up unambiguously, and had very much fallen away from it and had and rejected religion pretty strongly. And yet he could only talk about the Virgin. He would never say Mary's name, right? Almost out of some kind of deep respect and affection for the Mother of God, so that he would be ripping on the church in every which way possible, but don't say anything wrong about the Virgin. Now, again, you can critique that as fragmented, as disordered, as uncoupled from the deeper realities of the faith. Or you can see that as one small enduring thing that's real and connects this same person to a believing community and to his own faith life. And I'm probably of the disposition in life these days where I go with the latter. I want to see that as a virgin half full.
Well said, Randy. And gosh, I missed that show. Let's talk for a minute about the Catholic imagination. Right, this is a world that you work in, and this again for me and many listeners to this show who enter the church as adults are suddenly their eyes are open to this world they didn't know existed, right? All these books, all these authors, all the literature from the last 2,000 years infused with Catholicism that maybe you didn't see because you didn't know how to look for it. And then you begin to see churches on every corner, Randy, and they're Catholic churches, and they have beautiful architecture, and they have a history of in that place, in that city, in that town. I'm up here in Kitchener. We have some beautiful old churches on different corners that, that were there hundreds of years ago when the town was founded, and there's important history in those places. And you walk into the faith as a convert, and suddenly these things are opened up to your eyes. So let's talk for a minute about what you can begin to see as a Catholic when you begin to look around in the world, in literature, in art, in place. What does that bring to your experience of the world?
I think there's maybe two major points to make there. The one would be that to the degree that an imagination is Catholic, at its core, it is a sacramental imagination. So that just as we believe that the bread and wine during the kind of most mystical and in so many ways transporting moments in the liturgy become the body and blood of Christ, that gift and capacity, that gift to us, that capacity in these things to become wholly other, and yet still retain the forms of this world, just as God became man and dwelt amongst us, that core proposition infuses the capacities of a Catholic writer, a Catholic artist, with a right and a responsibility to seek to do, in secondary ways, similar things with words, with stories, with stone, with paint, with whatever it is, right? So there's that kind of capacity for a total conversion from one thing to another, which I think I'm inadvertently stealing from a Gerard Manley Hopkins account of the Transubstantiation, the great 19th century Jesuit poet. And then there's the second way to think about it, which is to think about the Catholic imagination in kind of sub-theological terms. So what does it mean to be a Catholic writer? It means that what's open to you is an active and living 2,000-year tradition that is global and local, historical and contemporary. And the most important thing in it is that it's living. So this is something I say often to my students at the university in a class I teach there called the Gilson Seminar on Faith and Ideas, which introduces first-year students to the intersection of faith with ideas about politics, religion, politics, literature, ecology, and science. That when you go to university, you can study any number of different kinds of traditions, political traditions, artistic traditions, philosophical traditions, religious traditions, but in most cases, they're closed to you. They're closed to you either because of history or because of knowledge or because of training. But the beauty of the Catholic intellectual tradition is how open it is to believers and non-believers alike to kind of join this thing and to make sense of it and to move around within it. And so for me as a Catholic writer, it is the perpetual kind of coming together of that core sacramental understanding of what is possible, of what has been made possible, with a kind of world and time that I get to move around in as a Catholic writer.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love the idea of that, the
Sorry,
sacrament.
let me say it a different way. A world and time that I get to move around in that is at once expansive and bound, right? That's kind of what makes it so interesting to me. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I can recall a time my wife and I had the opportunity to travel to Rome and see the Vatican before we were Catholic, actually, which is a shame because now that we're Catholic, we would have seen a lot of things differently, I think. But
yeah, but why is that a shame? You would have seen great things there anyway.
Well, this is the thing, and this I think riffs on your point entirely, Randy, of the openness of the Catholic faith to accessibility to others, right? We had quite a funny, jaded grad student as our tour guide of the Vatican museums and taking us around, and we were struck. I was struck by the art that the Vatican has collected, the secular art, the stuff that has no connection, no in air quotes connection to the faith, kind of struck us. And of course, our tour guide's kind of jaded commentary was, well, the Vatican stole all these things from different groups and they're holding them hostage, and there's probably, I'm sure, some truth to much of that. But I think the point was, like you say, that sacramental imagination, that idea that we make things with our hands and they're infused somehow and they're part of the creation of God and the whole purpose and point of our faith. That, I think, is why some of those things are in there, right? Because those things reflect that sacramental imagination and that beauty. And we can find that even in these secular pieces of art, right?
Yeah, well, because if they're made by the human person and the human person is made in the image and likeness of God, then it would seem to me mistaken to assume that only within an explicit and avowed Catholic frame can we find these things. And in fact, that kind of idea turns very quickly into ideology.
Yeah.
And I would much rather a superb work of art animated by atheism than a crappy piece of art that affirms my faith. Because I'm looking at art, right?
And that's a great point. And that leads into my next kind of thought to share with you. And that's the idea of, what's lacking these days in this imagination and how we're working it out? Because of course there is a lot of crappy Catholic quote unquote art being made, and that's, I don't know, empty or hollow, or
maybe I can explain it this way. Maybe this is
yeah.
a way to talk a little bit about my own work.
Yeah.
Bring up crappy Catholic work. A few years ago, I got in trouble by writing an article for First Things magazine that began, "I'm sick of Flannery O'Connor." And then I continued to explain that I was also sick of G.K. Chesterton, of C.S. Lewis, of Tolkien. I was sick of being a Catholic writer, living and active, who kept hearing about these dead Catholic writers from years before, as if Catholicism and the arts seemed to have ended decades before. And so I made the case in this essay, and I have been more recently with my most recent two novels, Original Prin and Dante's Indiana, for an imaginative exploration of what it means to be a believer in the here and now, as opposed to lamenting, I think, a kind of romantic and figmented version, a confected version of the past, where there was some perfect bell-ringing, integrated world of kind of wholesome Catholicism and educative art. I don't think that exists. I think that's a reaction against some of the greater demands and difficulties of our present moment. But those are demands and difficulties that I've tried to take on with Original Prin, which begins 8 months before he became a suicide bomber. Prin went to the zoo with his family, and that's a novel that begins with a family trip to Mass on New Year's Day. By the end of the novel, the main character apparently becomes a suicide bomber. And then with my most recent novel, which is also features Prin, this time helping an evangelical millionaire and a group of others build a Dante theme park in opioid-ravaged small-town America. And in these cases, what I'm trying to do is not imagine, again, some kind of perfect moment from the past, or idealized gauzy moment from the past, cue violins and communion dresses where everybody understood and believed the same and lived the same way. Again, that seems to me wholesome and false.
You're coming out swinging, Randy.
End of the day.
I love it. I love it. But and this is very close to your heart, obviously, right? And the idea that if we're going to live in this space as Catholics, we can't just live in the past and read these authors from the past. Do you hate Chesterton though?
I don't hate Chesterton. I hate what Chesterton does. I hate that Chesterton becomes a substitute for active imagining and arguing with the here and now. And I guess to some degree, I don't like Chesterton cleverness. Oh, what a clever clip. Oh, you won that round. I find that maybe a little tiresome, as opposed to struggling. Come join me in struggling with what it means to be a believer here and now, instead of lamenting that we're not in Chesterton's time, as if that was such an easy time. So it's not Chesterton. It's what people do with Chesterton and in place of doing something more immediate.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me, right? That the here and now struggle. So sure, you can read Chesterton here and now and be aided by some of the things that he says. There's fantastic stuff in there, but we also need people doing the work right now to struggle along with us, right?
And it's a material version of things. Let me be a Marxist for a moment, right? If you think about who controls the modes of production in the publishing world, let's just keep on printing Chesterton because nobody's buying any of these contemporary Catholic writers. And so it's a self-perpetuating problem. And then at some point, someone's going to get sick of reading Chesterton and realize there's no living Catholic writers to read, but it's a self-perpetuating problem. Let's therefore let's read more Chesterton. I think it has to do with the question of reliability. I have this memory of a conversation with a good friend who is a gold mining executive, busy guy, wants to read fiction, only has so much time in the day. I understand all of that. And I made the case that he should be reading well beyond my work. He should be reading contemporary literature, whether Catholic or otherwise. And he just said he didn't have time for it. And he didn't have time to kind of worry about whether it was worth his time. He'd rather kind of trust in the canon and read from there. But I was suggesting to him that the nature of canon formation is such that if he's not reading now, then the kind of people he would want to read in the here now will never be in a future version of a canon. And it doesn't help the cause.
Yeah. That's so interesting, right? So what's part of the solution other than to encourage contemporary Catholic authors, but how do we do that? How do we encourage that imagination to move out of the past and keep going into the future? How do we encourage more writers to begin to write and people to begin to be interested in that writing? Is there a secret sauce you're developing?
Yeah. So wrong way of putting it.
Okay.
We don't need more writers. We need more readers. Everybody wants to be a writer. Nobody wants to read. In all seriousness, this is one of the great problems, not just in Catholic culture, but more generally. I say this now as an English professor. I am amazed at how many people will approach me and say they want to be writers. And then I will ask them, well, who are you reading these days? Yeah. And they don't really have a good answer. If you ever put a couple of working writers together for a conversation, they're not going to talk about what they're writing. They will always talk about what they're reading. And so I think what we really need to do is create the conditions for more and more people today to be reading contemporary work. That seems to me very, very important. And then among them may be some who discern that they have a vocation to write. And if so, wonderful, and proceed. But if you're not reading always 2 books, one by someone who's living, one by someone who's dead, then it seems to me that you're not living a full imaginative life as a Catholic or otherwise.
Yeah. And what do you think about, because obviously we're not reading and writing in a Catholic bubble. Right. Obviously, Catholics need to be engaged with the world in some sense, but there is this sense of turning away from the world and, just reading Catholic authors, just watching Catholic media, just being plugged into the Catholic world. There's that tendency when the world sometimes is going haywire or it seems that way. What do you think? Like, where's the balance between unplugging from some of the things that are just going to drag you down because they're miserable commentaries, versus actually engaging with the world as a Catholic? Like, right. There's a balance to strike there, I think.
Yeah, I've probably changed my view of these things a lot over the years. There would have been a time where I would have suggested that the desire to retreat strikes me as a fundamentally Protestant desire, a kind of retreat in a creation of parallel worlds, right, for fear of contamination. I don't know if I feel that way the same anymore. I see it now more as an active discernment on the part of every person, on the part of every family, about how and how much to engage and to pull back. But in pulling back, it seems to me you should have no illusions about what it means to pull back. In other words, Rod Dreher's Benedict option works as long as everybody can still go to Costco, or have a square foot garden and still go to Costco. I mean, there's a sense of honesty maybe about what it means, well beyond reading, to balance your engagement with the world and your time beyond, and then your engagement with, your faith life. We are all called, I think, to be in but not of the world. That's true of what we read, what we consume, what we watch, who we hang out with. And there are probably some who, for whatever reason, whatever set of arrangements or elements, are called to a greater engagement. There are some that are called to a greater consolidation. I think maybe that's kind of where I am these days. For whatever reason, for whatever set of reasons, I live a very much a kind of a secular life as a writer and as an academic. And I am called within that context to figure out what it means to live out my faith, and to live out my faith in a way that is for the greater good of others. I think that's, and it's maybe a question of, how do you define the others? Well, it begins, of course, with my family, but then well beyond that, I feel like I am probably called in any context in which I find myself to demonstrate the irreducible goods that I can contribute to the greater good as a believing Catholic. And that's true of my writing as much as anything else.
How do you grapple with it? You said you're a contemporary writer, writing contemporary times. There's a lot of stuff going on in the Catholic Church these days, as I think there always has been. I've had historians on this show talking about the kind of maybe the myth of the golden age of the Church, and this there wasn't really as much as the Dark Ages are also a bit of a myth. This Golden Age also is kind of a myth in terms of Catholic history. There's always been bad popes and bad bishops and bad priests and whatnot. And the saints have risen up at every age in spite of those situations. How do you grapple though with these contemporary issues in Catholicism? Because these are often just seen as something that's lobbed at the Catholic faith, that's lobbed at the church as a hand grenade. And so how do you as a Catholic wrestle with those?
Well, I think there's maybe a couple of ways that I respond to that. The one is to think about how I can contribute to these conversations through my own vocation. And so, if I think about something like Original Prin, which was very much, a novel about what it means to be a believing Catholic in the here and now, a family man in the here and now. What struck me was the original version of it came back to me from my editor, an 80-year-old atheist, who said that his problem with the book was that it was not theologically serious enough. He said that what we got instead were just, smells and bells and opinions about Pope Francis. And he suggested that this doesn't make for good writing or good literary fiction. And so he encouraged me to kind of pull all of that out, all the opinions out, and instead create a novel in which, whether you are a believer or not, it matters to you, and you can tell and feel that the main character believes in God and lives his life as if God exists.
Yeah.
Right? Lives his life imperfectly as if God exists. I have discerned that this is something that I can do. I am not by temperament or interest an apologist or a polemicist. And so on the usual subjects, there's very little that I feel I can contribute that isn't already being done more vociferously and vigorously by others. As a professor who teaches a first-year class at a university about faith and ideas, it seems to me like my ability to create the conditions for a more supple, confident, and cosmopolitan approach to integrating one's faith with the most leading and pressing questions of the day is again something that I feel like I can do. But I want to add one thing there. My first year of teaching this class, I taught a short story by Ernest Hemingway called Hills Like White Elephants. Do you know it?
It sounds familiar. Yeah, I think I do.
It's a story, a classic Hemingway story. It's set in an unnamed Spanish town at a dusty train station, and it involves an older man and a young woman having a conversation as they wait for a train. And you never know what the conversation is about, but you know exactly what the conversation's about. It's about the man pressuring the woman into having an abortion. And tellingly, the baby is only ever referred to as it the entire time. Okay. And I have taught this story I've taught this story as a kind of grammar lesson about, how much you can, about the indeterminacy and then the specificity of a word like it, depending on the context around it. But, in teaching it in a class on faith and ideas, where certainly everyone would be kind of activated when it comes to the question of life, but not necessarily everyone in that class would have been pro-life by any means. What struck me as really unexpected was how little interest they had in discussing the political side of the story. It seemed to me like I was almost kind of undermining the kind of free intellectual space that we had created with this seminar by introducing the hand grenade, right? And so that's something that I keep in mind, right? This is where I am. This is where I've been called to vocationally as a writer and a professor. And so what can I do here to create the conditions where, you can kind of not toss back the hand grenade, not duck out of the way, but not notice but basically just realize that the hand grenade is often, a lemon.
Like literally a lemon, like literally just a yellow lemon. Yeah, not a working hand grenade, but yeah.
But a lemon, yeah.
Yeah, a lemon.
There you go. Different version of transubstantiation. Hand grenade into a lemon.
That's fantastic. I know what you mean though entirely. there have been some times when I'll see somebody in the podcasting space or on YouTube that I really want to engage with, and I think, oh, this person, they've got this totally backwards or something, or I feel like, I'd love to just give a little word in here, but it's oftentimes and most usually the case that it's not my place to get involved in that. Right? There's a discernment I think that takes place in knowing how to engage on certain issues, right? And I think as a new Catholic, as an adult convert in my I guess late 20s, I would have been a lot more fiery for certain topics. I tried to jump in, on Facebook and, guys, look at this. Have you heard of this thing that the church does? And you're missing out on this thing. But there's a discernment that takes place there, right? Especially as we interact with a world that doesn't see things how we see things, doesn't live in the sacramental space that we live in, right? It's quite a different mindset that we're trying to speak from. So there's a discernment that takes place there, I think, or is required there to communicate well, right?
But then also maybe a humility in this sense. Years ago, I was trying to help out my mother-in-law, who works at a pregnancy crisis center in Milwaukee, with an appeal that she was writing. And it struck me as way too blunt and graphic. And so I rewrote it in the thoughtful, qualified language of an academic. And she said, Randy, the people I work with are not the people you work with. And the people that I serve are not the people you serve. And, it would make no sense for something like what she wrote to kind of appeal to even the most simpatico person, let's say, in my professional life or my social life, and vice versa, right? And so, maybe the humility that I'm trying to describe is not me saying, oh, if only everyone could, have these elegant, qualified hedging approaches, and oh, I'm a tenured professor, so I can only do so much. Why can't everyone be like me? That's obnoxious. And so I fully respect and acknowledge all of these different versions of engagement, and don't expect anyone kind of to radically change their thoughtfully discerned and decided upon engagement just because it doesn't look like mine. That's the other mistake, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely. Yeah, I want to ask you, I want to preface this with a bit of a story. There's a lot of conversation happening in North America these days, and really in different parts around the world, of the role of the Catholic Church as the conqueror, or as the settler, or as the force that came in and wiped out indigenous culture and communities all over the world, right? Not just in North America, but where we are, that's a hot topic. So, I had that in mind. I'm having conversations with different people, and I met a guy who came from a family of Pentecostal missionaries who went up north in Saskatchewan and went there to found a Bible camp in this indigenous reserve community, and ended up becoming Catholic. And they were evangelized by the deep Catholic faith of this indigenous community that they came to save as this conquering force. And in turn, their lives were completely upended. Two of the children, the male children, are now priests. One is the head of his order. It's a radical conversion for this family, and it strikes me as so interesting. I mean, they're both great storytellers, these guys. So there's definitely some fiction in here, or something, the story to be told. But it's so fascinating that here is this very settler mentality of people going up there to save this group of people, and ending up being converted themselves to a faith that at some point was brought in from the outside to this indigenous community. So I mean, it makes me think of the intersection of the Catholic Church as this colonializing force, this conquering force, but at the same time, because it is this 2,000-year-old thing, at the same time, it does reach all over the world because it colonized a lot of the world, but also it now infuses so many cultures for good, and then and gives back. How do you wrestle with those kinds of themes, those kinds of kind of heavy questions?
I think probably most people would debate the question of whether the church continues to infuse culture for the good. But I think people would not deny the validity and sincerity of any person's freely held, decided upon faith, including Indigenous persons. And so, where I really saw what you're describing as a very knotted issue this past year in Canada, uh, was following the really awful discovery with respect to the burial grounds of near a school in Kamloops, British Columbia, for our American listeners. If I'm not mistaken, there were a couple of examples of churches being burned as a form of kind of anger and protest. And I can think of at least a couple of news stories about Indigenous Catholics who were lamenting that this was happening, because for them, as fraught as it might be in so many ways, the church, as in small c church, their church community, was also a source of solace, comfort, and community. And so on subjects like this, I don't think of myself as a conventional settler, as a second generation immigrant to Canada. But it seems to me that the persons I would want to hear from about how best to understand these things would be Indigenous Catholics themselves. They seem to me to be the most affected by these sorts of questions, and then also the ones that I think can perhaps offer us the best guidance about how to think through how best to proceed.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I struggle with understanding, say, the force of the church around the world, right? You, as you said yourself, you came to Canada with a Catholic faith. I think of, the church is the same everywhere under one pope, but comes from all kinds of cultures now. And how do we I think as the church present the faith, live the faith out, but see that as a good thing, in spite of the fact that it has stamped out some cultures, right? Does that make sense? Like the tension between loving this faith and it being universal, but also it being responsible for damaging people, groups, and cultures around the world as it expanded. That makes sense.
Well, the church is a church of sinners, and the many ways historically that the church, through its members, has created harm. I'd like to hope and believe, for the most part, in unintended ways, but alas, certainly when it comes especially to clergy abuse, in intended ways, it would seem to me, is something that I think we all have to kind of accept as what it means to be imperfect members of this perfect thing, the church itself. And I also think that it's important in these situations to consider our own implication in all of this, right? In other words, there are many ways that everyday ordinary Catholics, as opposed to, crusading, capital C, Catholics from the Middle Ages, or the Counter-Reformation Church, or the church that declares terra nullius and then proceeds with versions of colonization all over the place. There are all of those historical events that are subject to ongoing interrogation and critique. But then there's all the shabby ways that everyday ordinary Catholics don't live out their faiths, that I think are things that we can perhaps more immediately remedy if we were decide to do so, as opposed to hand-wringing about all the terrible things of the past, or people who hate the church and complain about the church and don't remember, the church created literacy, and look at all the positives. That kind of scorecard Catholicism seems to me useless relative to amending where you can and the ways that you can.
Do you see part of your vocation as a writer? I mean, there's a lot of, I think, probably perils of being a Catholic writer that you'd encounter, I'm sure. Do you see your vocation as a writer, in a sense, doing some of those things, making some of those inroads where you can?
Yeah, I mean, as long as what I'm doing isn't as a Catholic, but as a writer,
Yeah.
I think that's what's very important. If I were trying as a writer to convey a sense of human experience, of the inherent dignity of the human person, the irreducible complexity of human life when fully lived out, a lived out life, within and under, kind of under a religious sense, then I think I'm doing what I can. If I were to try to convey, 3 key points of the faith with some really interesting stories, no, I mean, Jesus did that better with parables than I ever could with a novel.
That's well said. And I think I know, I can hear where you're coming from. I remember reading a book that was rather popular here in Canada a while back, that dealt with, an abuse scandal in the church. And it seemed to me to be a little bit heavy-handed reading the book from this perspective. And then I remember I heard an interview with the author where they just kind of laid out all the grievances with the church, and they were a former Catholic or whatnot. And then I go, yeah, that book came from this certain place. You could feel that once you understood the context. So I see the danger in falling into that. If you set out to do this, and this in kind of an apologetic fashion or something, or an anti-apologetic fashion in that case, you end up doing just that, right? And it can come across like that.
Yeah. And again, there's probably a time and place for it, but it's not my time and my place.
Yeah.
Bracket, thank God. And so I don't think I could do it if I tried, and I wouldn't do a very good job of it. And so, there's 2 versions of a response to that. Well, wait till you get to a point in your career or your life where you can, and then do it. And then you never probably will. Or ask yourself again and again, well, what can you do right now? Not just on the page, but in your next meeting, in your next conversation with your neighbor, in deciding whether to get ashes at the 8 o'clock mass or the 8 p.m. mass, and then live your life the rest of the day. Right? These are all ways that we can bear witness, and that we have to kind of, I think, take seriously.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. Okay, so you don't want people to be writers; you want them to be readers. So
Well,
they should.
listen, my wife has the best version of this.
Okay.
She wrote her doctorate on 20th century poetry, and non-academics will often ask her, "Oh, do you write poetry as well?" Because she wrote her dissertation on poetry, and the short answer is no. And her longer answer is to point out that if you need to write, you absolutely need to write. If you don't need to write, you absolutely should not write. And if you think about the romance of being a writer, I think that perhaps encourages people in the wrong direction, because it's what a lovely idea to be a writer. There's something kind of transporting about it, and exciting about it. But the real excitement, the real transportation happens when you are reading. So if you don't love reading, then something's wrong, right? If I were not, look at it this way, if I were not a published novelist working away on whatever I'm going to do next, I am certain that I would still be writing stories. I'd be writing stories for little journals that nobody reads, because I have a vocation to be a writer. If you have a vocation to being a writer, you absolutely need to live out that vocation. If you don't, then live out your vocation otherwise.
And read.
Yeah, and read. Absolutely.
So your books are wonderful, Randy. I truly mean that, and I will put links in the show notes to those. What else should they be reading? What else should we be reading to encourage that Catholic imagination from a contemporary place? Do you have, apart from don't read Flannery O'Connor and these other people who will just throw under the bus there and keep on going? Who should they? What places should they be going to find stuff to stoke that imagination?
Well, I think the idea is that you stoke your imagination in lots of different ways, not just by reading Catholic writers, as important as living Catholic writers.
Yeah.
I'd say lately, one book that really struck me was Jonathan Franzen's new novel, Crossroads, which is about an Illinois Lutheran minister and his family in the early 1970s, and more or less their crack up. And why I would recommend that book is that Franzen writes, I think, better than almost anybody alive about family life. He writes unapologetic, old-fashioned novels with respect to things like plot complications and revelations and the like. But it's also a book that is strikingly empathetic to belief. I am certain that Jonathan Franzen, at least based on interviews, is not himself a religious believer, but he conveys with great sincerity and even earnestness what it means to be a believer, the struggles of it. I was really, really, I kept waiting for the wink, and he never does it. So I would say that of late is maybe one book that I've really been taken by. For perhaps more formally ambitious readers, I would recommend The Other Name by Jon Fosse. He is a Norwegian writer, a convert himself, and he writes difficult but beautiful fiction about an old painter near the end of his life, basically getting ready to meet God and surveying, his life to date. It's to some degree stream of consciousness. The entire thing is a meditation, really, on the opening of John's Gospel, manifested as memories about life as a painter growing up in Norway. It's beautiful and very moving. And I would, again, strongly recommend something like that.
And I guess the beautiful thing with the faith, I'm thinking back to that experience at the Vatican Museum, right? Is we can read anything in a sense, right? And find in there the spark, the sacramental sense of turning words into ideas. And we're secular or otherwise, believer or not, right? We're drawing from the same source, right? Of creativity in the end. Is that fair to say?
Well, again, insofar as we are all made in the image and likeness of God, we all have these capacities, right? In different ways, in different ratios, in different levels. But yeah, I'd say, Keith, that's the question isn't whether you have a vocation, but rather what your vocation is, and how are you called to live it out, Catholic or otherwise.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Randy, it's been an absolute thrill to have you on the show. It's been really fun. Yeah. So thank you. Thanks for your time. Where do you want to point listeners? You're kind of a lot of places. Where can they go to find out more about you and to follow your work? Is there some places you can point them towards? Is there a one-stop shop? Or
I'm not on social media whatsoever, so you're not going to find me there. But probably the best way to get to know me would be through reading my fiction. And so I would just say, for people interested, my most recent novels are Original Prin and Dante's Indiana, and they would perhaps be the place to go.
Yeah, and they're really fantastic. I mean, the opening scene of Dante's Indiana, right? Your unique character. I mean, right from the very first page, it kind of drips this Catholic imagination in my mind. He's I think I don't want to spoil it for the listener, but it's fantastic. It's great, Randy. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I want to say, honestly, God bless you in the work you're doing, the fantastic work in teaching and in writing, in appearing on my radio once in a while, as I'm listening in the kitchen doing dishes. It's always fun to hear your voice and your commentary. So thank you. Thanks for being here in this little podcast.
Thanks for a very good conversation. You take care.
Yeah, thank you. You too.